As I promised, or maybe it was the other group I promised, that you're going to move away from the world of monks and their uh, tough, simplistic, pure discipline, and we're going to talk about the First Buddhist Woman. And this is a wonderful book, and it's a translation and commentary of a very old part of the Pali Canon, which is the Theravada canon, still being used in Southeast Asia. And it's called the Theragatha. And these are poems by early Buddhist women. And over time, it's come to be a collection of both stories of women and the poems they wrote. Although the stories are probably fairly legendary, and the poems are oftentimes have similar themes. It does sort of show how the early Buddhist Sangha was experienced by women. The whole phenomena of an order of women spiritual practitioners was, at the Buddha's time, still a very radical idea. He actually was not the first to have an order of nuns. That was the Jains, who predate Buddhism perhaps by 100 years, had already created an order of nuns. This idea that you could have a renunciate order was there. But the Buddha, fairly early on, as he created his order of monks, was also asked by women, perhaps the wives of the monks who left him, so we don't want to stay here either, we want to have our own. And so various women were asking him, including the woman who raised him, his foster mother, his ex-wife, all sorts of women were asking him, and then some of the disciples like Ananda were asking him, and finally the Buddha said, "All right, I'll do it. You can have an order of nuns." He kept saying, "I hear what you're saying, but don't bring this up again." But finally they kept pestering him and he agreed, but then he made some special rules for the women. But that was still a very radical thing to have an order of women. And apparently in early Buddhism, as we talked about before with the monks were actually wandering around on their own. And then they would get together from time to time. And very early on, the women too often would wander on their own and eventually settled or would be in groups. Obviously, for a woman, even in noble ancient India, to wander alone in the jungle, was not always led to good outcomes. So they tried. Eventually, the wandering days came to an end. But there were women who were wandering spiritual practitioners, women also living together. In this particular society, it was there's not a lot of freedom for women, other than being a spiritual practitioner was a tremendous change. Women were always under the control of a man. When they were under control of their fathers, and then when they got married, the control passed to their husbands, and then when their husbands died, their sons controlled them. So they were never independent. And but when they became nuns, then they were sort of independent within this sort of democratic, egalitarian order. So obviously, a lot of their poems are pretty excited about the difference between the two lives, because it's a very hard life as a woman in ancient India under such circumstances. So this is a book of their lives and their songs, and as legend would have it, the first nun was in fact the Buddha's foster mother. So she was the sister of Queen Maya, and her name is Mahapajapati Gautami. And she and the Buddha's mother Maya were sisters, and the Buddha's mother, after giving birth, died 7 days later. So then the king married her sister, and her sister raised the Buddha. And so she was a fairly important person, and she had asked the Buddha different times to create this order, and then finally, as I said, that they did. And they did make 8 rules that women had to do. They were called 8 special rules. And basically, they said, I would ask one thing of the Blessed One Ananda. Oh, I'm sorry. He has these 8 rules. And the 8 rules are I can't seem to find the list, but basically they had to respect men. They couldn't be bothering the men and so forth. And most of them were sort of putting them under a particularly subservient status with respect to the monks. And the reason the Buddha claims that he did this was because it was sort of in keeping with the social nature of that time period, that women were definitely a subservient sect group, and in none of the religious circles were they accorded equal respect with the men. Although, interestingly enough, given the egalitarian and democratic nature of the early Sangha, people were pestering the Buddha on this point. So there was already, even in the early Buddhism, a sense that women, at least the women, felt they were equal, even if the men weren't in agreement. So the Buddha's mother becomes the first nun, and then various other women start to then become nuns as well, and she's sort of the leader of the nuns. She lives to the ripe age of 120, and she has many disciples. And some of the groups that she gets, there were a lot of women who were widows because of the wars that they would fight, and those women would oftentimes become nuns. And then there were a group called the harem. So about 8 of the Buddha's former consorts from his palace harem decided that they would now convert. So this is a pretty good sign. The Buddha, adopts a new life, and even his old lovers adopt a new life too. And among those, his former wife becomes a nun as well. So they're a group, and they write some poems of realization. And then there are various other women who just, for one reason or another, are inspired in this kind of way. And so then this way, the early groups of nuns develop. And as we said before, they have additional rules that they have to follow, which are essentially to keep them in a humble way. For example, the 8 special rules, here's a list of them. A nun, even of 100 years standing, should respectfully greet, rise up in the presence, and bow down before, and perform all duties towards a monk ordained even a day. That's the one that they had some problems with. A man is not so to spend the rainy season in the district where there is. A nun is not to spend the rainy season in a district where there is no monk. So there always should be some monk in the area for advice and counseling. And then basically other things related to subservience of with respect to the monks. A nun is not to revile or abuse a monk. Of course, we already heard that a monk is not supposed to revile or abuse a nun either. And so basically, things to keep the two groups apart so they focused on spiritual practice. But as I said, they formed communities, and they also had their own teachers. And then some of their teachers, they became famous for just the same things the monks became famous for. Some became famous meditators. Some became famous Dharma teachers. Some became famous in keeping discipline. And so they had various different kinds of rules. And they would also provide spiritual advice to lay people, and then to themselves, to other nuns, spiritual women who are spiritual practitioners. They did not provide spiritual counsel and advice to monks, but that was the monks' loss there. But otherwise, they had a pretty full spiritual life. So this is Patanjali, his mother, Mahapajapati Gautami. And she, as I said, she lives to be 120. And this is her poem. This form is the beginning of this collections of poems of the women elders. And it runs like this. Homage to you, Buddha, best of all creatures, who set me and many others free from pain. All pain is understood. The cause, the craving, is dried up. The Noble Eightfold Way unfolds. I have reached the state where everything stops. I have been mother, son, father, brother, grandmother. Knowing nothing of the truth, I journeyed on. But I have seen the Blessed One. This is my last body, and I will not go from birth to birth again. Look at all the disciples together, their energy, their sincere effort. This is homage to the Buddhas. Maya gave birth to Gautama for the sake of us all. She has driven back the pain of the sick and the dying. So that's her poem. And the line especially telling enlightened, and then they're giving voice to their experience of to their enlightenment experience, to their realization. So her realization is when she reached this state where everything stops based on the teachings and the practice given to her by the Buddha. Now, one of her students, a widow named Mita, and she becomes ordained, and she writes this poem. To be reborn among the gods, I fasted and fasted. Every 2 weeks, day 8, 14, 15, and a special day. Now with a shaved head and Buddhist robes, I eat 1 meal a day. I don't long to be a god. There is no fear in my heart. This is a poem from another one of the early nuns. Her name is Daisy, and she seems to have it's taken her a long time to realize the Dharma. She's been a practitioner for a long time, and finally find someone who can help her. The teacher I met, that's her mother, and then receives enlightenment. So her poem goes like this. It was 25 years since I left home, and I hadn't had a moment's peace. Uneasy at heart, steeped in longing for pleasure, I held out my arms and cried out as I entered the monastery. I went up to a nun I thought I could trust. She taught me the Dharma, the elements of body and mind, the nature of perception, and earth, water, fire, and wind. I heard her words and sat down beside her. Now I have entered the 6 realms of sacred knowledge. I know I have lived before. The eye of heaven is pure, and I know the minds of others. I have great magic powers, and have annihilated all the obsessions of the mind. The Buddha's teaching has been done. A couple interesting phrases here. One of them that gets repeated in this series of poetry. I went up to a nun I thought I could trust. She taught me the Dharma. It's this communication of person to person. So one of the senior nuns is the person that the new ones are coming into. So then they become eventually senior nuns, and people come to that. So the nuns are passing the song woman to woman. And in that role, they become teachers, they're becoming spiritual preceptors. Just like the Buddha's mother becomes sort of the spiritual advisor, the Kalyana Mitra, the friend to these new nuns. And this is an example where she does that. They also, in their turn, would become befriend nuns and teach them the Dharma. So they, in their way, become elders and take on this role, this role of teaching function. The other thing is that the idea of being taught something. I mean, here's a woman in a society where basically you're there to cook, clean, and raise children and nothing else, and well, produce children, primarily that as well. But here there's an intellectual life, there's a spiritual life. She's learning, she says, I learned the 6 realms of sacred knowledge. I know I've lived before. So there, not only is there spiritual development, but there also tremendous intellectual development and understanding. So it's a much broader life for these women who are there. And as we can see, they're very excited by that, and also that there's no limit to their spiritual development. Just like some of the best of the monks and the other followers, I have great magic powers. I've annihilated all the obsessions of my mind. That's another stock phrase, annihilating the obsessions of the mind. And then the Buddha's teaching has been done. In other words, the Dharma has been realized by me. So that's the kind of sort of testimony that these early women were giving. Another early disciple of the Buddha was a woman who became quite famous as a teacher in her own right. It's called Patakara, and she became a under the Buddha's um, foster mother, and then she became a teacher in her own right, and had 30 nuns who were underneath her. And she had one of these stories that are common in the Buddhist world, where she's married, she has children, and then one day they're out, and she's got 2 children and a husband, and the husband gets bit by a snake and he dies, and then there's a raging river, and she takes one kid across the river and puts it down, then goes back to get the other, and then an eagle eats the kid that's on the one side of the river, and then the other one falls in and drowns. And then she's lost her whole family. Then she gets across the river, she goes visit her parents, and just that day their house has fallen down and they're all dead, and they're all the smoke from the cremation fire that you can see, that's her parents. So she goes mad and wanders around naked for a number of years after that. And one day, still mad, still walking around in circles, she entered the Jeta Grove where the Buddha was preaching. Those who had gathered to listen wanted to keep her away, but Gautama followed her and put himself in her path. As she encountered him, he said, "Sister, recover your presence of mind." And at that moment she recovered her presence of mind. She saw that she was naked. A man threw her his outer robe. "Help me," she said to the Buddha, and she told him her terrible story. He replied, "Patakara, don't think you have come to someone who can help you. In your many lives you have shed more tears for the dead than there is water in the 4 oceans." This made her grief less heavy. He went on to say that when she herself went to another world, no kin could help, not even in this world no kin can help. And then he spoke of the Buddha's path, and when he had finished, she asked if she could be ordained, and together they went to the community of nuns, and she was accepted there. So that was Patakara, and sort of a remarkable story there, where the Buddha here is sort of like healing people like Jesus does in the New Testament. You know, "Sister, recover your presence of mind." So you all should remember that phrase as disciples of the Buddha in case you encounter a similar situation. And it's interesting, he doesn't, the monks, can you imagine this disheveled, naked woman who's been wandering in the jungle for 7 years, shows up with the disciplined arhat, as and these men aren't even supposed to be around women, and she's showing up, and they're all not freaking out. And he particularly makes sure that he comes into contact with her, and he doesn't say anything to her about her, just tells her to wake up, and after that she sees that she's naked, and then she can sit down and be a normal person. Again, the Buddha is the great exemplar of skillful means. So she writes a poem. "When they plow their fields, sow seeds in the earth, when they care for their wives and children, young Brahmins find riches. But I've done everything right and followed the rule of my teacher. I'm not lazy or proud. Why haven't I found peace? Bathing my feet, I watched the bathwater spill down the slope. I concentrated my mind the way you train a good horse. Then I took a lamp and went into my cell, checked the bed, and sat down on it. I took a needle and pushed the wick down. When the lamp went out, my mind was freed." The very kind of Zen Satori experience here, sort of also like a Sangha, with his struggling. These women are very persistent with their meditation, even though they get the instruction from the Buddha. Interestingly, the Buddha says, "Well, I can't really save you. but you can save yourself. And then she goes and she practices, and years and years go by, and she doesn't feel like she's gotten anywhere. But then one moment she stays with it, and puff, there it is, and she sees everything and is at peace. So another group, as I mentioned earlier, were these women who are wandering. And this is kind of an interesting group because it seems that in India, just like there have been since beginning of time, renunciates wandering around in the woods doing spiritual practice, there have been women wandering around also doing spiritual practice, probably even though it's a bit more dangerous. And some of the early Buddhists were also wandering spiritual yoginis, and the name is a Kariki, and there's also a Samani, a female renunciate, a female wanderer, and so there is this sort of group that has done this for a long time. And even when the Buddha's there, at that period they're wandering. And then eventually, as I said before, they tend to get rounded up and put into nunneries. But then when we get later on to the Tantric times, which are, maybe 1,200 years later, we get the phenomenon again of wandering women. In fact, wandering women, these yoginis who are out in the charnel grounds, are initiating the yogis, and they're the ones who have all the wisdom. So this whole idea of a wandering female spiritual adept is fascinating. And here, what's fascinating is that though it doesn't really come into its heyday until the Tantric era, even in this early Buddhism, you do have these kind of independent women who are out there in the woods practicing by themselves. And that's definitely, goes against the social grain of ancient India. And also they have teachers, and learn Buddhism in that way, and so and of course they have to before they get to the poem, and the poems are all very sort of simple Buddhist poems, we have to get a Bollywood story. So there's a particular wanderer that they want to have a story of called Bada. And Bada, she's a daughter of a rich family in India. In fact, he's like the chief of the town. And one day she sees a robber being taken off to the cliff where they throw robbers off the cliff. It's the execution cliff for robbers. And he's a really good looking guy, and she falls in love with him instantly. So she pleads with her father to save this robber, and so reluctantly he does this, and he has the man bathed and dressed in fine clothes and brought before her. And it turns out he's the son of a neighboring king, and so they get a new beginning, and so they get married. And unfortunately, though, he's still really basically a rogue and a thief, and he's more interested in her jewels than he is in her. And he says that, hey, on his way to Robber's Cliff, he made a vow to the cliff deity, and of course, in the ancient world, everything had deity. The cliff deity, that he would make an offering, so they prepare an offering and they go to the cliff. Of course, when they get to the cliff, he says, do you really think I came here to make an offering? I came here to get your jewels. So he makes her take off all her jewels and her clothes, and he's getting ready to throw her off the cliff. And she says, well, wait, I have one wish before I die. And she says, we married him, but you haven't embraced me, Len. At least embrace me before I die. So he says, all right. So she embraces him, and then they do one position, and then they do another position, and then finally she throws him off the cliff. And it says here, and then embracing him from the back, she pushed him over the cliff. For this act, even the deity of the cliff applauded her, praising her keen presence of mind, saying, wisdom is not always confined to men. A woman too is wise, and shows it now and then. But so after that, she decides she can't go back to her family. So she becomes a wandering yogini, and she joins the Jain sect, and goes through all their austerities, has all her hair pulled out, masters their teaching, but she's still not really happy, and she's become quite adept at philosophy. So she goes from town to town, and she puts an apple branch in a pile of sand, and that shows that anybody here wants to debate me, I will debate them. And after she defeats a number of would-be philosophers or spiritual teachers, she doesn't get much action in terms of debate, until one day she happens to put her rose apple branch in a pile of sun where the Buddha is teaching. And Shariputra's there, and he takes the branch down. So actually the Buddha, Shariputra gets into debate with Bhadra, and she asks all her questions, and he answers them all perfectly. And then came his turn, and he asked her, one, what is that? Bhadra paused, and not knowing how to respond, asked that he become her teacher. Instead, he sent her to Gautama, who recognized the depth of understanding and gave her instruction. Hearing his words, she attained immediate enlightenment. Then, in a rare gesture of respect, the Buddha ordained her by simply saying, "Come, Bhadra." So, per the rules, you had to go through an ordination with the nuns, you had to be ordained also by the monks, you had to be doubly accepted and go through a fair amount of ritual to join the order. But in this particular instance, this woman is so, the Buddha can see she has such potential that he just immediately initiates her into the order. And she, Gautama considered Bhadra first among the nuns in the speed with which she gained nirvana. So she gains nirvana very quickly and becomes a famous early woman teacher. And this is her poem. I cut my hair and wore the dust as I wandered in my one robe, finding fault where there was none and finding no fault where there was. Then I came from my rest one day at Vulture Peak and saw the pure Buddha with his monks. I bent my knee and paid homage, pressed my palms together. We were face to face. Come, Bhadra, he said. That was my ordination. I have wandered throughout Anga and Magdala, Vaji, Kasi, Kosala, 55 years with no debt. I have enjoyed the alms of these kingdoms. A wise lay follower gained a lot of merit. He gave a robe to Bhadra, who is free from all bonds. A little odd random verse there at the end as she recalls this person who liberated himself by giving her a robe once. But this is the basic idea. These women lives are full of pain and suffering, and no doubt more so than the men, legitimate suffering. And Then they find the Buddha, they receive instruction, they become peace, they have freedom. Here's another of the wandering women. Obsessed by sensuality, I never got to the origin, but was agitated, my mind beyond control. I dreamed of a great happiness. I was passionate, but had no peace. Pale and thin, I wandered 7 years, unhappy day and night. Then I took a rope into the forest and thought, I'd rather hang than go back to that narrow life. I tied a strong noose to the branch of a tree and put it around my neck. Just then, my heart was set free. Another Zen moment of awakening. And one last one here from one of the wandering women. Although I left home for no home and wandered full of faith, I was still greedy for possessions and praise. I lost my way, my passions used me, and I forgot the real point of my wandering life. Then, as I sat in my little cell, there was only terror. I thought, this is the wrong way. A fever of longing controls me. Life is short. Age and sickness gnaw away. I have no time for carelessness before this body breaks. And as I watched the elements of mind and body rise and fall away, I saw them as they really are. I stood up. My mind was completely free. The Buddha's teaching has been done. So, what do you think of the Buddhist women?
Bruce, could you kind of go over the, you started to sort of go over those 8 rules, and a lot of it had to do with respect towards, I guess, monks, or, but I didn't really catch some of the others.
8 special rules.
They probably shared some with the monks.
Unique to nuns only. So they say. So it goes, a nun, even of 100 years standing, shall respectively greet, rise up in the presence of, bow down before, and perform all proper duties toward a monk ordained even a day. Number 2, a nun is not to spend the rainy season in a district where there is no monk. 3, every half moon a nun is to await 2 things from the order of monks: the date of the Aposaka ceremony and the time the monks will come to give teachings. So the monks provide the nuns with when they're going to have the confession ceremony and when they're going to give teaching. 4, after the rains retreat, the nuns are to hold a paravana to inquire as to whether any faults have been committed before both sanghas, that of the monks and that of the nuns, in respect to what has been seen, what has been heard, and what has been suspected. So there's a confession ceremony where they not only confess to the other nuns, but they confess before the monks. So you can see that right there is holding them to a pretty tight standard. They certainly wouldn't want to be having to confess something. A nun, number 5, a nun who has been guilty of a serious offense must undergo the discipline before both sanghas, that of the monks and that of the nuns. Number 6, when a novice is trained for 2 years in the 6 precepts, the first five precepts that lay people take, plus the precept of taking one meal a day. She should then seek ordination from both sanghas. The nuns they do it a little bit differently. A monk would join the order right away. He'd become a novice. He'd take on the robe. He'd take the vow of celibacy and such. And then he would, after a while, he'd become a regular monk. And then after a certain number of years, you get a special title like elder. And the women had that too. They become a bhikkhuni, like Bhikkhuni Pema Chodri, because she'd been a monk for 10 years, a nun for 10 years. But nuns, they would start them for a couple of years where they basically were still lay people. They just had an extra vow. And they started to, they would fast after noon, in the afternoon, and they would take the basic precepts, but they actually could still live at home, and they weren't even under the vow of celibacy, nor did they have any robes or anything at that point. Then after 2 years, they could get ordained and go through the normal thing where they were celibate and the true renunciate. So there was kind of a pre-probationary period for the women nuns. So that was rule number. So when they did get ordained, then they had to do it before both the nuns and the monks. That was rule 6. Number 7, a nun is not to revile or abuse a monk under any circumstances. So no bitching at the monks. And number 8, admonition by the nuns of monks is forbidden. Admonition of nuns by monks is not forbidden. So the monks could correct the behavior of the nuns, but not vice versa. Although it seems that in the Prakti Moksha Code that we read, which is of later date than these 8 rules, the monks are pretty much told to leave the nuns alone, and certainly not to be criticizing their behavior. So I suspect that didn't pan out well over time. Interestingly enough, the order of nuns died out in the Theravadan countries. So it died out in India, it died out in Sri Lanka and all the Southeast Asian countries. It died out by the fairly early on, 8th, 9th century, somewhere in there. But they had nuns in China and Tibet, Nepal, Korea, and Japan. And very recently, not in our lifetime, maybe 20 years ago, 30 years ago, something, I think nuns from Tibet ordained for the first time since like the 10th century, nuns in the Theravada tradition, so that they could get their order going again.
So no doubt he finally accepted him in to like the religious order, I guess, out of like compassion or whatever, because for one thing, it was his stepmother, right, and his wife, or foster mother, first couple of the ones, and but yet he still tried to maintain those social norms or whatever, however you worded it, which seems unusual because he sort of, the caste system was a big part of India then, and he sort of went against that. So surprising that he
well, Buddha, his favorite is he's teaching the middle way, right? So here he's kind of doing a middle way solution. He's in a bit of a compromise, right? If he goes too far with the women having too much independence, it's going to cast all sorts of aspersions on the order of Buddhism, because the women are, they don't have that kind of freedom in Indian society. The only women who have freedom in Indian society are prostitutes. They're the only ones who are outside the control of any one man. Prostitutes, musicians, acrobats, and three other categories that are essentially, they're all prostitutes because I mean, they have other skills as well, if you will. So yeah, there are independent women in ancient India, but and so then you got female ascetics are actually often thrown into that class because they're independent women. And if you rape, for example, somebody's wife, that's a crime, and you're going to get a fairly severe penalty. If you rape one of these traveling acrobats, or you rape a yogini, that's a crime too, but it gets a lesser penalty because they don't belong to anyone. So the Buddha is a little tougher on the women because he's trying to differentiate them from in being independent women. They can't, if you let them be independent women, then they're going to be seen as a type of prostitute. And if he, so he kind of does, so he goes the middle way, lets them get free from the Indian domestic life, but he doesn't go the full way of independence. Now, by the tantric time, the wandering women who really don't care, they probably are prostitutes. They're probably yoginis and prostitutes both, and that's okay. There's less deference to the opinions of others at that point.
I mean, it was an interesting line about the having magic powers that could annihilate all the obsessions of mind or something. So it's just a different idea of magic powers there. It's when you can.
Well, that would be the only magical power worth having. Everything else is just going to lead to attachment, or would be a sign of attachment, right? Only the power that eliminates attachment is the word power worth having. Or you could say only the power that eliminates power is the power worth having. Because that desire for something else, that's what you want to get rid of so that you can have that space and freedom of open, liberated mind. So yeah, but it's pretty amazing testament, really. I mean, these are women who are coming there out of Bollywood, situations, and under the most stressful situation it could ever be for a woman. They're out they're tied by all this family network, and then just everybody obliterated around them, and yet somehow out of that they find a sense of who they are in a deeper spiritual way, and the women with that much on their minds are able to clear their minds, become free of their obsessions, free of any neurosis, free of any worries or concerns, free of being bound by emotionality and conceptuality. I mean, that's just remarkable testimony to the power of meditation, that it can liberate people in all different kinds of situations, even the most insanely horrific.
I guess that was a true test also of the monks to be able to maintain their vow, the precepts, and be mingling or whatever. So, because even all that meditation, you kind of build up a lot of energy and or something like that. You probably had like Vipassana romances or something like that. Some of these.
Well, that is a difficulty, and in fact, it's a tremendous difficulty in renunciate type situations. In that there's a period in your developing spiritual abilities where the whole world becomes more vivid, right? In your Vipassana experience, right? That Vipassana experience, all your sense experiences are going to become clean and vivid and fresh, and you're going to see things more clearly, and you know your desire is going to be kind of purified, but there still will be desire. It's just that everything's going to be pure and more intense and more vivid. And so the difficulty of, if you had conceptual means to kind of keep from being overwhelmed by sexual desire, those will kind of fall away, and you'll just have to be kind of pure sexual desire. Now, Tantra that realizes that, and that's exactly the energy it wants to utilize in different ways, but we're not there yet. So here, yeah, they have to kind of bathe in cold mountain streams and keep up the yoga. It's interesting. You get a sense when you read through these poems by the nuns that they kind of, in a way, they connect very much with the idea of being saved from samsara, and this gratitude they feel towards being awakened. And there's really little concern about our pride. You know, a little bit here and there we saw, but a lot of the male monks, they're more. There's less emphasis on gratitude and more just sort of showing off their skill, if you will, or their attainment. I think the women, you really get a sense of the emotion behind this whole experience of awakening and moving from one kind of life to another. At analytical detachment. So I think it's really interesting. You see a little passion and more humanity, if you will, more humanness comes through with the women writers, I think. And they zero right in on the essence too. You know, it's not. And these poems, where they had this life, and then they got the teachings, and then they woke up under some spontaneous circumstance. I mean, these are from like 2,000 years ago, and this is the same plot line of a spiritual self-help book written this week. You know what I mean? I mean, these books are still being written. Women are still having this wake-up moment, and it's a very long tradition here and I think that's a testament to the truth that this witnesses to every experience. This is how it is. In fact, that people go through a lot of suffering until some point they get some instruction and they're able to lift themselves out of it, and that produces a tremendous feeling of gratitude. Well,
Very nice.
thank you all. Uh, I continue to explore the forest, which will be the home for forest meditation someday. A few weeks ago, I don't know if I've told you this story. I discovered there's some large trees on the property. And I mean large, I mean like 4 foot width diameters, which is big for a tree. And these are sugar maples. And then I found one that was even bigger, really huge tree in the back of the property. And I went and I got this forester's tapes to measure how big this was. And this one was 20 feet around. The girth of it, 20 feet. I mean, the thing's, it looks like a sequoia or a redwood. Right. And so I look up to see what the state champion maple tree is, sugar maple tree is in Michigan. Then mine is 40 inches bigger than that. And I look to see what the national champion is, and mine's 20 inches bigger than that.
Wow.
And I'm thinking, man, this is amazing. And of course, if this is a sugar maple and it's that big, then the thing is like 600 years old, which is also worthy of veneration. And so I'm not ready, and I'm thinking the maple syrup from this will sell for, $1,000 a drop, right? Cure everything. So I thought, well, before I, announce this publicly, the discovery of the largest sugar maple in the world, I better go take a closer look at it. Because, the trees are really tall and it's a forest, so I can't see the leaves. And I just assumed it was a sugar maple because that's what I mostly have, right? So I go back and I look at it, and this time I take the binoculars, and I'm sitting up there trying to get a good look at it. And yeah, my sugar maple turns out to be an oak tree.
Oh.
Which is fine. I mean, an oak's a respectable tree. It's a white oak. And, but white oaks get pretty big, and it's nowhere, it's short of the state champion, let alone the national champion level. So I'm just glad that I found out that it wasn't a maple before I tapped it and tried to make maple syrup out of it. That said, though, it is a 425-year-old white oak. It is 6.5 feet diameter, and that makes it. That's why it's so. It started its life around the year 1600. So that makes it one of the oldest. That makes it a pretty old tree in America. So. I think I want to build a kami shrine by it. So I've been thinking of it needs to have a small shrine. It also needs to have the area around it cleaned up, but you build a small shrine.
What's a kami? What's a kami shrine?
In Japan, in Shinto religion, they feel that special objects in nature have a special deity or spirit connected to them. So, like a large tree, a waterfall, a grove, perhaps. That particular special places in nature are special because there's a special spirit attached to that. And to honor that spirit, which is a kind of nature spirit, and there are thousands of these in Japan, I mean, essentially not the number, they would build these little kami shrines. And they also would have, so kamis are the spirits, and they're like nature spirits, and they're part of the Shinto religion, which until a couple hundred years ago had sort of merged with the Buddhism in Japan. They were kind of practicing both. So Buddhism would often adopt kind of that kind of local pagan mythology, mythic view, if you will. So anyway, yeah, they're very pretty and they're very unusual because they don't have anthropomorphic deities. These are intangible spirits of a particular place, right? I mean, the object is the tree, so the tree, but the spirit doesn't really the tree. The spirit just, inhabits the tree, of course, or the waterfall or whatever, the cave. But they would build these little shrines, and they would have like mirror, but they would use odd symbols. There'd be a mirror, ribbon, statues of foxes. Just abstract symbolic stuff like that. There's like 4 or 5 different things that they use.
Is it like locopalas?
Yeah, they're local pollen. We call them local pollen. So yeah, I'm approaching the forest in the traditional manner of uncovering and honoring the local polos, as opposed to the more modern manner of getting a Kubota and putting on or plowing through some roads and some ATV trail.
Yeah.
This fall, I'm gonna camp out there. I'm gonna have an encampment there for a week or so, at some point in the fall, depending on the weather. And hopefully by next year, I'll be ready for a fall meditation retreat.
Oh, awesome.
Being a mostly maple forest, it should be very pretty. It'll be all orange and red in the fall, depending on that. So it'll be pretty spectacular.
Wow.
But we will see. Well, we dedicate merit here. By
Let
this,
us merit.
may all attain our missions. May we defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth to old age,
Sickness and death.
in the ocean of samsara,
May
may exceed all beings.
Thanks, Bruce. Sorry I couldn't be here for the majority of it.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
See you next week.
Thank you, Bruce.
Bye.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.